my name is Albert Dadon. I'm the chairman and founder of this leadership dialogue. The three guests that we have today have been with me from day one. Day one was May 2009, if you guys remember. So I'm very happy to welcome today from Israel, Professor Boaz Ganor. Hello, Professor.
Thank you very much, Albert.
And Boaz is also the executive director and founder of the International Counterterrorism Institute in Israel. Is that right, Boaz?
This is exactly right. Thank you.
Okay. And so how are you doing in Israel? How's your confinement going?
The confinement is being eased from day to day. The situation is improving. The numbers of people which are in need for healthcare is going down. As we speak right now, we have about 16,000 people that have been infected with the coronavirus, but only 4,000 are still considered ill in a way, and I believe that less than 100 are in need for medical treatment. We had about 260 people that died in the whole wave of the recent wave. But now everything is improving. I mean, the malls are being opened. The only thing which is still closed are restaurants and swimming pools. So we are waiting for that.
Before you go on,
and movies.
You started in the 4 cylinders, maybe the 6 actually. I'd like to introduce our other 2 guests as well. So we've got Christopher Pyne, who is in Adelaide presently. So Christopher is an Australian politician, former Minister of Defence, and many, many other positions that he has held during his tenure in Parliament. And he also has his own podcast that's the Pyne Time, which I highly recommend. Hello, Christopher. And you are in Adelaide.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join your webinar. I'm delighted to be part of it.
You are always welcome. And we have Michael Danby, and Michael, former politician as well, maybe a politician, always a politician, of course, but has retired from the House of Representatives. He's a member of the Labour Party, and Michael, in his time, during his time in Parliament, he was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee for a number of years, also the junior minister for the arts at some stage. Welcome to you, Michael.
Namaste.
What language was that, Michael?
Hindi.
In Hindi.
Thanks. Benjamin is good enough for him. It's always been very exotic.
Yes, absolutely.
Not as exotic as you.
Defender of the minorities.
That's very conservative. Closer to the Count de Monet than me. You're supposed to be taking this seriously, Michael. I am. But I'm a good friend of yours. I say that with great affection. Me too.
Okay, so let me go back to Boaz, because Boaz, you started giving us some important statistics as to what's happening in Israel. But at the same time, can you give me your opinion as to whether Israel has overreacted, whether it hasn't, is underreacted? What did you think overall? I recall I was in Switzerland at the end of February when Israel actually cut the flights from Europe. And I wanted to go to Israel at that time. And I was told I was going to have to be confined once I get there. And I didn't know what that meant, so I decided to go home. So tell us.
Yeah, I don't know how much time do you have for the whole webinar, because to answer your question, I need the whole hour that you
can you take a shortcut? You know.
Sure. I'm just kidding. When we're asking the question, did Israel overreacted or not? Of course, there are different views in Israel. You have 2 Israelis in one room. You have 4 opinions at least. But the question is difficult to answer. First of all, because we are still in the midst of the event. It's not over yet, so it's very difficult to judge. The second reason why it's a difficult answer because are we limiting ourselves to the health perspective, the number of people that died, or the ability of the healthcare system to sustain the situation? Then yes, it was a great success. But what about the economy? We're just starting to understand the impact, the enormous impact, the disastrous impact on the economy. And I cannot say if it's overreaction or not. Only after we'll know what was the implications of that. Because at the end of the day, when we are talking about how a government is dealing with the coronavirus, it's always the question of finding the right balance. Finding the right balance of giving the healthcare to those who needs that without the collapse of the system, limiting the number of people that are dying from that, but at the same time limiting the longer implications like the economy, like the anxiety, fear, psychological impact that we start to see it now and we'll see it in the future as well. And bear in mind that we are talking about the first wave. Nobody knows what would be on the second wave if it will happen. So to cut a long story short, answering your question, in a retrospective point of view, I think my opinion is yes, Israel overreacted. But I say it with a lot of, I'm trying to be humble because it's a temporary retrospective point of view. I don't know what would happen without this so-called overreaction of Israel. And if the situation would have been deteriorated, probably my evaluation, my estimation would have been changed, answering your question.
So if I may ask you a political question, Bibi Netanyahu, your prime minister, he was going to go to court, as I don't have to tell you that he's indicted, of course, and he was going to appear in front of the judge. He asked the judge to actually postpone the court by a few weeks, and the judge refused, and the next day he announced a confinement, so the judge had to postpone. So that's perhaps the cynical view. What do you think?
Super cynical.
Yeah, there are many, again, you know, the Israelis are divided almost exactly 50% are pro-Bibi and 50% are against Bibi. Those 50% which are pro-Bibi believes that he's the son of God, and they believe that the coronavirus and the way he actually ran the country during the coronavirus, proving that he is the son of God. Those who actually believe that Bibi is the worst thing that ever happened to Israel have many, many claims and many cynical views about the way that he conducted the coronavirus crisis. One of those claims is the claim that you have mentioned, that just the day before his first hearing, he decided, it's not him, it's his minister, but it's quite clear that it was his decision. He was running the show. He closed, by the way, not all the court hearings, but only that level of the court that actually refers to him, and it delayed the opening of his trial. Well, if it's cynical or not, I don't know. Many things have been closed at that time, have been confined at that time. And practically, regardless what you think about Bibi and about his trial on corruption, it's quite clear that in this severe crisis, you don't want a prime minister being in court and spending the time which is needed to defend himself when he's trying to defend the whole country.
Yeah.
So it's
and I
definitely.
understand that during this time, of course, Israel has announced a government of unity. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's connected to this dispute as well, because if you ask the leaders of the opposition, the new opposition which is coming, they would say he was taking advantage of the corona crisis to create an emergency, and that's the way they call it, an emergency government, not a unity government, an emergency government. But the claim is that there is no any urgency right now. The situation is quite stable.
But what's the deal between Bibi and Gantz? Are they going to share the prime ministership?
Yeah, the whole idea today that they're going to be sworn, both of them as prime minister, the current prime minister and the future prime minister, first time ever, that will be sworn probably today. and it would approximately a year and a half, they will exchange the places. So from today, we're going to have two prime ministers. The current prime minister.
You say the first time ever, wasn't there a national unity government with Shimon Peres at some stage in the last 25
years?
Yes,
we had unity government is not a new creature in Israel. We had at least I think twice unity government, but this is a very weird type of unity government. We never had a situation in which the next prime minister is being officially declared as a replacement prime minister on the day that the first prime minister is being sworn. This is, of course, doesn't come from a lot of love from both politicians or trust that they trust each other. It's all procedures that they meant to secure the fact that there will be a change in the leadership of Israel within a year and a half.
That's probably the guarantee of Gantz, and
yes,
that was probably his demand before he accepted to join in.
Right.
And
right.
do you know what is the date?
Excuse me?
The date for the change over in prime ministership. Do you know, is it a year and a half? Is it 2 years?
It's a year and a half. It's about a year and a half. It's the end of 2011.
2021.
Yes.
21.
Yes.
Add 10 to 11 and we're right.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Boaz. I'd like to ask Christopher, you are in Adelaide. Well, what do you think of the situation, first of all, in Australia, and then tell us about your state as well, please.
Well, thank you, Albert, and it's very nice to be part of your webinar for Frank Talk.
It's not mine, it's yours too, my friend.
Good. Look, obviously, we've been very lucky here in Australia, and in South Australia in particular. Being an island is a tremendous advantage, and we were about 2 weeks behind the rest of the world in terms of the spread, and that gave us a really important buffer in which we could see how other governments were reacting or not reacting. The example of countries like Israel was instructive to us to go hard early, whereas the decisions that were made in places like the UK and the US were also instructive, and I think they didn't act as quickly as they should have, and certainly the British government has recognised that, and I think fairly. So we've done well here. We've had a few deaths and not nearly as many infections as like-sized countries around the world. And I think we'll come out of it faster as well, economically. And we're already staggering the undoing of the economic lockdown, which has been severe. But I think we will have a poor quarter in June, and then an okay quarter, not great quarter, in the first of next financial year. And then I think by spring, we will be starting to get back to relatively normal economic position. And the last shoe to drop will be international travel, which I think probably won't be until 2021 in terms of starting to recover. I think from a wider point of view, we need to consider how the world recovers internationally from what has proven to us all that we are inevitably interconnected. A phrase and a conversation we've had many times, but the pandemic proved that despite our very national approach to issues, we are globally connected, and there was no escaping the pandemic, whether it was China's fault or anybody else's fault. And I think there will definitely be an inquiry, an international inquiry, which may or may not get to the bottom of it. The absolute proof is that we are very interconnected globally, and yet our international fora that have been established to manage this interconnectedness was proven to be entirely inadequate for the task. Whether it was WHO or the United Nations, and it has been proven before, like drug testing in sport. These were the straws in the wind that we took no notice of. The pandemic has proven beyond doubt that the global pretensions of international fora have been completely unmet by their capacity to respond. So I think coming out of the pandemic, it'll be interesting to see how the world and the major countries of the world who lead it, and Australia and Israel, the European nations, obviously America, Russia, how they respond to actually the capacity meeting the rhetoric of all these international fora. I think that's one important point. And the second important point would be in terms of overreaction, which is a common theme and one that you've raised in questioning Boaz from the beginning, is
the same question
not
goes
over.
to you.
What's that?
The same question goes to you.
Yeah. Not allowing the media and the social media in particular to drive an overreaction. So governments, statesmen and women have to respond calmly and in a considered way to the challenges the pandemic has exposed, as opposed to a overreaction driven by the desperate and continual need for social media for crisis, because this is actually a real crisis. SARS killed 700 people. This pandemic will kill hundreds of thousands of people. And while the media loves a crisis, public policy makers, including second and third track policy makers, like the International Institute for Counterterrorism and the dialogue that you head, need to actually be more than just overreactors.
Absolutely, but it does not preclude us to analyze objectively the facts on the ground and what alternatives could have been taken. For instance, in our case in Australia, there are several questions that I will have for you in a moment, but first let me go to Michael Danby. Michael is in Melbourne. I think that Melbourne is the state that is the most confined in this country. What do you think of the whole situation, Michael?
Christopher made a very interesting point about Australia paying heed to Israel. Now, I think that's certainly true at a policymakers level, first, second and third track. And it was, the Yiddish word nachas, Christopher, derived pleasure to see the Prime Minister of Australia with Netanyahu and the Prime Minister of Austria and Czechoslovakia in that first responders group, they call themselves, the first actors, those who acted quickly and have kept the rate down. I have a doctrinal difference with Dear Albert over overreaction. I think we at the beginning of this, as Dr. Fauci says, we don't know whether we've overreacted. I think we haven't. I think if you extrapolated the Israeli figures, roughly same population, to places that haven't overreacted in inverted commas, Sweden, Israel would have not 250 dead, but 2,500 dead. It's roughly the same population. But the people who say we've overreacted say that when we come further into the coronavirus crisis, this will all even out. The curve will flatten at the same place. Israel will have a second wave and it will go up to the Swedish wave. I'm not sure that's true. I'm very grateful for the fact that our government acted very quickly here. I certainly think Christopher's right. It has all kinds of implications. And Israelis will understand this probably more acutely even than other Westerners, because they've long had doubts about the United Nations, about the UN Human Rights Council, and this feeds into all of the problems we have with organisations like the World Health Organization. I think it's a shame they didn't listen to Taiwan early on, that they kicked them out a few years ago, even as an observer. Things can be true even if President Trump says they're true, and I think that there are things that are
Can you repeat what you just said?
Management. Sorry?
Can you repeat what you just said?
I think that things can be true even if President Trump says they're true. So his point that the World Health Organization there is a problem with them. I think they didn't alert countries around the world early enough that this was human transmissible. I think they listened to Beijing too closely. And it's all because of the nature and the structure of the UN Human Rights Council, the World Health Organization, etc. So we need to address those kind of problems if we're going to avoid these kind of issues in the future. But it's very good for it to be normal, Boaz, for Australia to be in company with Israel, as Christopher said. I noticed the young Austrian Prime Minister asked us to participate in this group. Unfortunately, it isn't the case with our media. They need to catch up with the political leadership here in this country, because the number of developments that I've been alerting Christopher and Albert to in Israel that are applicable to Australia, the discovery of antibodies by one of the hospitals. All of these kind of things are worth reporting here on the news, because it affects the life and well-being of Australians, just as your work was in counter-terrorism. What happens in Israel happens here 5 years later. So
Yeah,
we're all an interconnected world.
When you
Don't
say,
you think, Michael, there's a problem here that our Australian media find it hard to imagine that Israel could actually come up with something that is worth exporting to anybody else, because they are so blinded by their long-standing biases around the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
well, that's
Exactly, as Albert said, exactly.
Michael, what you said about the antibodies in Israel, can you expand on that? Because do you mean antibody testings? Because antibody testings are happening all around the world right now, so it's not something that you could attribute to Israel. So what do you mean?
Well, as I understand it, in Sharid Zedek Hospital, there is some discoveries about the use and identification of these antibodies that would be very useful for other countries.
Well, antibody testing has been going on for a while already. So that is how you can determine.
Michael doesn't refer to testing.
I beg your pardon?
Michael referred to a medicine which is being developed based on those antibodies. And there are at least two main efforts in Israel. Actually, there are many more, but two main efforts that seems to be quite successful. One is Sharid Zedek, as you have mentioned, and the other one is the Biological Institute of Israel, which reported that they have a breakthrough in industrial antibodies into process into a medical treatment. And that happening, as you said, Albert, also in other places, but we are also the front of that international effort.
Okay, that's very interesting. Christopher, are you aware about what is happening in the UK?
Which aspect of what's happening in the UK?
In terms of the figures, where they're at in the curve, are they starting to
well, they've had just over 33,000 deaths, the worst in Europe. They're reopening their economy as of today, which I think is unusual given their position on the curve. The curve in the UK has not really, it's flattened, but not flattened nearly as much as places like Australia or South Korea. And I think they are making a decision that they're going to weather the storm in the same way as I think President Trump has made that decision in the US. And they're not going to close down their economy in the way that we have in Australia. And that's their decision. I think that will lead to a second wave of infections. Not a choice that we've made in Australia. It's a choice that they've made there, and they'll have to weather that for good or for ill.
Yeah. Michael mentioned a second ago the example of Sweden. Michael, do you think that it's a good thing that at least the Swedes have shown us an alternative way of doing things?
Yes, but at the cost of all of their older people.
You will
2,000 more of whom are dead than ought to be.
You will
anyhow, that's
tell whether that's the case or not in a few months, if not in a year.
Well, that's exactly your and my difference with each other. You're right. If in a few months everyone else catches up to them, and pro rata, we have to go through the same awful experience to get herd immunity. Of course, the motivations of the Israeli and Australian and Austrian governments were to keep the rate of infection down by this fierce lockdown, because they weren't sure they had enough hospital ventilators and that the system wouldn't be overwhelmed. So that was a good motivation. So you can't criticise them for that, and I'm not saying you are. But let's see. I think Israel, Australia, Austria, South Korea may have a distinct advantage, because if we've kept the numbers of dead low, we've locked down, and we keep practices where there's not a second wave in these countries, then we'll have the benefit, unlike the Swedes, of a low death rate and no second wave.
Do you know where that second wave expression comes from? Do you know where it comes from or not?
Maybe from the Spanish flu.
Spanish flu. Do you know there's been other epidemics since the Spanish flu, and there's never been a second wave? So we don't know if there is going to be a second wave. In fact, we really don't know why those things disappear when they do. I wish we did, but really we have no idea as to why that is.
In the 14th century, the plague came back 10 times.
Which one?
In the 14th century,
I'm talking about since 1918, since the
yeah, but history is history, right? So whether it was 800 years ago, whether it was 100 years ago.
Yes and no, because the hygiene in the 14th century were quite different than the ones that are here today. And I think.
Yeah, but I think I just think people comparing Sweden with Australia or other countries are not comparing apples with apples. The Swedish government's decided that they will tolerate politically a very high death rate, 4 times higher than Norway, twice as high as Denmark, 3 times higher than Finland. I don't believe the Australian public or the Australian media would tolerate our government saying we are going to tolerate a death rate at that level when it could have been avoided. And
so, Christopher, how many deaths
did we have to compare the two?
How many deaths did we have so far in Australia?
What is about 80?
80.
No, it's a bit more than that. It's a bit closer to 100 now, I think.
Right. That's about 4 per million. It's surely the lowest in the world. Surely.
One of the lowest. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, we cannot attribute this low count simply on policy, or do you attribute it all on policy?
I think it's to do with lots of different aspects, but one of them is the fact that the government acted quickly, having looked at what was going on around the world. Because we're an island, we could cut off our country from the rest of the world. That was a tremendous geographic advantage, and we shut down international travel quickly, and not just in window dressing. We made it really impossible for people to come and go, and we were very strict about it. So I think that there was a public policy aspect, there was a geographic aspect. I think Michael makes a very good point, though, by the way. The flattening of the curve wasn't about the fact that we thought that we would be able to beat the coronavirus. It was about not having a spike in people going to the hospitals and not being able to treat them. So, you know, a lot of people who don't think about this very carefully don't really understand that when the government was talking about flattening the curve, they were talking about keeping people out of hospitals because we couldn't cope with what had happened in the UK, Italy, Spain, France. We had to stop them turning up to emergency departments. So we cleared out elective surgery, all the other measures to free up the hospitals. Now, maybe we went too far, but actually, you have to say, it's basically worked.
Maybe we didn't go too far in the beginning, because in the beginning, you have an unknown who you don't know. So therefore, the government responsibly does whatever it needs to do. But I think, and most importantly, I would like to know what you think. Is it possible that in Australia, the Prime Minister, when he made these announcements about the confinement, that there was a bit of a lack of vision is the wrong word, but he did not foresee how he would get out of the deconfinement, because in the beginning he was saying this is going to last 6 months, which was absolutely scary. As we saw, it lasted 6 weeks. But now the Prime Minister would like Australia to get back to work. He would like the kids to go back to schools. But the states, for most part, especially in the state of Victoria, they are refusing to do that. And therefore, it seems to me that the genie was left out of the box by the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister doesn't quite have the control of that genie anymore. What do you think?
Michael, what do you think?
He doesn't, but it's inevitable that he doesn't, and he was doing the right thing when he kept the Australian economy going. The unemployment is remarkably low here. The economy is still ticking on. I think we're yet to see the worst economic effects. The worst economic effects will come when the package of spending that he takes off come back, and when businesses have to either decide to re-employ all of those people at their own expense, when leases have to start to be paid again, when banks start calling up mortgages. That's in 3 months' time. I hope this, we're able to transit our way out of that. But again, Australia's been very, very lucky. Our problem is smaller than the Chinese problem. Just sideline this for a second.
Let's because that will be our next topic. Can we please, Michael, stay with what we've got here, which is we're dealing with how Australia has reacted. And insofar as what you're saying, if I may correct you, you're saying that the unemployment is very low and we're very lucky. I don't know in what planet you live, sorry to tell you this, Michael. But the unemployment
lower than what it was expected.
It's an incredible peak, and insofar as the reason why those figures are artificially not telling the full truth is because there is a government program paying those people $1,500 per fortnight. So that is, when someone was on $100,000, for them to get $1,500 per fortnight, and then they're not on the job seeker, but on the job keeper, and that takes them out of that statistic. We should not claim victory on something like that. The fact of the matter is, Australia has taken an incredible, unprecedented measure. I think that the deficit just announced by the government is the biggest of all times. Let's not be scared of telling the truth, right? And $120 billion. And I think the Prime Minister would like very much now, given our very low level of death in this country, for us to all go back to our businesses. And unfortunately, the state governments don't let us. I know that the Premier of Victoria is in your party, therefore you don't have any...
I have no him on
you don't
these
have
matters.
any.
But
I don't hear
all
any
I say,
criticism on your part when it comes to Mr. Andrews. What do you think? That's why I asked you the question, Christopher, because you're not from the Labour. So you tell us what's happening in Victoria, if that is right, please.
Well, I think every state in this federation has to make their own decisions. And I do think there are arguments that Victoria is slightly different. Melbourne is slightly different. Melbourne's done pretty well so far. And when I'm talking to people in the government in Canberra and here in South Australia, and I express surprise at how Victoria is not opening up, they have presented me with some quite good reasons as to why Melbourne can't afford to have an outbreak, because it's not the same as Sydney. It's hard. It would be harder to control because Melbourne. I mean, Michael knows Melbourne better than I do, but Melbourne, and you do, but people tend to go into the city in Melbourne, whereas in Sydney it's like 6 different cities that are connected to each other, and it's actually easier to separate people. And Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane are smaller. So I don't know exactly why Daniel Andrews has made those decisions. I don't think it's because he has some kind of narcissistic desire to keep control over the Victorian economy. I think that's all kind of laughable. I don't think he wants to destroy his economy any more than any other premier does. I do think there are probably health reasons why he's made those decisions. But the rest of the country has not, and I think we will come out of this.
We do live in a democracy, and shouldn't he come out and tell us what those reasons are so we can criticize them? Isn't that the easiest thing in the world to say, I've got very good reasons, and not tell us what they are? And you yourself, you just tell me that you've got some government people in Canberra telling you there are good reasons. What are they?
Well, I'm not at liberty to say what they are. I'm not the government of Victoria. But I think there are apparently health reasons, and that's a matter for him to outline.
But that is not good enough to tell us nothing and to say, just trust me. We don't live in that kind of countries, Christopher.
Write him out.
I'm very scared that people of all sides of politics are giving themselves a good hand and keeping themselves together insofar as their decision making to be so opaque that we cannot say anything about it. No voice is coming out to question those decisions. It's not normal. We do live in a democracy in Australia, and I think people have forgotten that.
Fair enough. Strong words.
Albert, may I jump in?
Boaz is back.
Yeah, I'm back.
Welcome back.
Please, Boaz, tell us what you think of our situation now that you know a little bit more about what's going on here.
Actually, I want to keep on building on your argument that we are living in a democracy, and make some comparison to subject matter which I'm quite more familiar in, and this is terrorism. You know, I find a lot of similarities, maybe we'll talk about that later on, between the terrorism or global terrorism pandemic, as I would refer to that, and the virus, the coronavirus pandemic. But one of the common denominators, that's the only one I want to focus right now, following your argument that we are living in a democracy, is that in both crises, the global terrorism crisis and the coronavirus crisis, you find yourself, the government finds itself, the prime minister finds itself, the public finds itself in a contradiction sometimes between efficiency in countering this pandemic, this phenomenon, and holding the liberal democratic values in general, or should I say privacy in particular, and so on and so forth. We had this debate, and we still have it, in reference to the Israeli government decision to use a very sophisticated cyber technology of surveillance that used to be very effective in counterterrorism, but now it's being used to surveil the Israeli citizens, of course, for good reasons, but still very concerning. For me as a counterterrorism expert, I feel quite bad. I'm not so sure that there are
no... Is it compulsory? Measures. Is it compulsory in Israel? Because it's voluntary here. Yes. We're trying to do a voluntary version.
That's exactly what worries me, because it's compulsory. Nobody asked the Israeli people. We are all now being under surveillance, and whenever they want to use it for good purposes, I don't think that the Israeli Shabak or the Prime Minister use it for other purposes. But this is a glitch. This is a glitch in the way the democracy deals with our own society. You can find that especially when life on stake. In counterterrorism, this democratic dilemma, which I call the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism, is how do we prevent terrorist attacks from occurring by using those measures in order to protect life. That's exactly the challenge here in coronavirus. The argument is that we can protect the lives of the people much better if we harm their liberal democratic values and their right for privacy and other rights altogether. Well, unlike other two colleagues, I thank God every day for not being a politician and need to make such harsh decisions altogether.
And the question is, when does that end? And how does it get undone? Because right. Once the government knows that it can do that, when does it get undone? I mean, what we've discovered in China is that it's not undone. So the facial recognition, which now exists across much of China, has now become a part of daily life. And we saw what last year or the year before, the marking of Chinese citizens for doing good, which means they get extra marks, and who decides that they've done good versus doing ill for the state. So it's a very important question, and it goes to the whole question of the overreaction and how to undo that once governments know they can do it. And if they tell us that they've undone it, whether they've actually undone it. How will we ever prove that?
Boaz, do you know when the Israelis will undo what they've done, or is it a permanent situation?
There was a very interesting debate in the Israeli Supreme Court a few weeks ago on that question. There were human rights organizations that appealed against the government for using that. And this was the first time ever in the Israeli history that the whole trial was aired online. So I was sitting in my home in confinement and listening to the whole discussion, which was very interesting. Now, the question that was posed by the Supreme Court judges to the government was, when are we going to end that? Because officially it should have been ended in late April. The discussion in the court was a week before, and they said, no, we are going to prolong that. Actually, we are going to deepen it. Because their argument was that when people are in lockdown, yes, we need this tool, but less than when we are freeing the market and people are going around wherever they want. Then we need the tool even more, so we want even to have further prerogatives to the security services to monitor that. This is debate which is still being conducted in Israel. And as Michael was asking before, I see you raised the hand, I'll end, but as you said before, I believe that this tool should have been not compulsory. I mean, if, God forbid, I would be ill in coronavirus and the government, the security services would come to me and say, can we get into your cellular phone and see maybe who was in close proximity to you? I would say go for it, of course, but not compulsory in doing that all over Israel for all the Israeli citizens all the time.
Christopher, can I say to you, are you satisfied with the privacy regulations of the voluntary app in Australia? And can I just say to you, Boaz just said something so interesting. Why doesn't the Shmegege, who is the ABC Jerusalem correspondent, give us a snapshot of that debate in the Israeli Supreme Court on voluntary versus compulsory apps, that affects the lives of Australians. It's much more interesting to us than the rubbish about the conflict, which is at a low point at the moment. That's a fascinating story. And we know in Australia, Christopher, that judgment of high courts and courts of appeal and comments of certain judges are very, very interesting to the general population.
Christopher.
I have downloaded the COVID Safe app. I thought twice about it, 3 times actually, 4 times about it before I did, because I wasn't absolutely confident that the government would be able to protect my privacy. But when I looked at it and started to download it, I realized that I was giving them information that was readily available and that it might be of use. But I am skeptical that when the coronavirus is passed, that we will be able to take a tool away from the government that is useful right now for our protection, but would also be useful from any government's perspective, from knowing where we are and what we're doing at any particular point in time. So I was very reticent, but I did it for the common weal. And, in Australia, we probably can trust the government to undo it. Because in a liberal democracy, they have proven to do the right thing. But, how many countries in the world would we be able to do that? I think it'd be very unlikely in most countries that if the government has that tool, they would willingly give it up. I think Australia would be one of the very few.
That is one thing I totally agree with you, Christopher, that our Prime Minister definitely doesn't have any of those tendencies that the Premier of Victoria seems to be displaying at the moment. But having said that, one thing about the Australia app that was said up front is that the data is only kept for 21 days on the app. So there is this automatic deletion. What isn't clear at all is whether that's going to be permanent or not. I haven't downloaded the app because apparently 60% of people don't have to. And so I'm part of those 60%. So, but thank you guys for downloading the app. I really appreciate that. Sorry, Christopher, were you asking a question to Boaz? Because if not, I'd like to continue on with our next subject. And that is, of course, the Wuhan virus coming from China and the history of that. Our country, Australia, has is leading actually the world in demanding of China to go into an inquiry as to what happened in Wuhan. This has, we had some retribution virtually immediately because the ambassador of China in Australia immediately gave us some warnings as to what would happen if we continued along that path. And this has been materialized because over the last few days, China is openly boycotting the beef coming from Australia. And that's probably a warning. I also heard that former Prime Minister John Howard said that we should cool down about the rhetoric on China. That's surprising coming from John Howard. I have to be honest with you. I think that John, in his heydays, would have never compromised as to what our values are. That came as a surprise. And perhaps I ask you, Christopher, this question first, given that you were serving as a minister under John Howard. What do you think of his comments? What do you think will be happening now? Are we getting into, are we going to continue along that path or are we going to let this go?
Well, I think that the Australian government's call for an inquiry is hardly controversial. What would be more bizarre would be if there was no inquiry. Now, whether the inquiry comes up with anything useful or not is another matter. but there has to be an international investigation. And I think China would be well to embrace that. And they might well not respond positively to it, but looking like you don't want to have an inquiry is much worse than accepting it and working with it. I'm not surprised at all by John Howard's comments. I wrote a column in the Advertiser on Monday, which was not dissimilar to John Howard's remarks, which is basically criticizing China and is all very well, but what's the end game? What is the outcome you want? Now, if it's just to get shit off the liver, great. But and once that's done, great. But what is the actual end game you are looking for? And in foreign and defense policy, you need to think beyond making yourself feel better by getting a front page in the Australian. You actually have to think, where is this going to end? And what John Howard did quite successfully was actually balance our military alliance with the US, which grew stronger under John Howard, with our trade relationship with China. And one of the reasons for that was that a wealthy country that is growing with deep reserves and economic strength can actually invest in its military. A weak country couldn't invest in the $200 billion build-up of our military capability if we don't have the money. So the end game of having a trade relationship with China and a military alliance with the US, they actually mutually support each other. And I think that's what John Howard managed to achieve. Now, that's hard to convey in 150 words in the television news at night. And being in lockdown for the last 8 weeks, 2 months, I've watched a lot of commercial television newses, and I've noticed they don't exactly do a deep analysis of the policy that we all do. And I think we probably spoiled ourselves by knowing more about these things than most of the television nightly newses are conveying. But the reality is, it's not as simple as, 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. It's much more complicated than that. And I think John Howard's probably stated the obvious.
Very good. Michael, what's your view?
Well, Christopher, 2 legs bad, 2 legs good is an expression actually used by George Orwell to criticise communism. So
it's from Animal Farm. It's from Animal Farm. And 2 legs good, 4 legs bad.
Yeah. So my point I was trying to make earlier was I don't understand from China's point of view where this is all going to come out, because take it at its best case, I don't believe the stuff about biowarfare being deliberately let out and all of this kind of stuff. But the stuff coronavirus spreading all over the world, it's ruined the economies of all of their customers. We're going to, all of us, come out in a different place than we were before this crisis economically. I don't know whether the same social customs in Western countries, international travel, movies, theatres, all of this is going to continue to exist as it was before. Albert may have different people who are customer of his at the Jazz Hotel. I don't know whether there will be people who come to listen to jazz in basements where they're so closely confined, although it's good food and good music, etc. You don't know where this is all going to lead. And the problem, Christopher, is in John Howard's day, this equally applies to Israel. In fact, more applies to Israel because they don't think seriously enough about it as we have here, that China has changed. Since Xi became a dictator and abolished the 2-term presidency, China's military and diplomatic aggression is something that we have to handle. So Australia has shown that we can continue to trade and have Chinese investment, but we can't let them think that they can buy political parties through foreign donations, interfere with Comintern-like activities, which they call the United Front Department. They can't constrict our trade in international seas like the South China Sea. And, you know, we have to smile nicely, have international investigations, but we have to change, for instance, the leadership of the World Health Organization to make sure that there is not a puppet sitting there when there's the next international medical crisis. We need a person who would act coolly and calmly in all countries' interests, not just their biggest recent donor.
But it's also hard for Israel, right, to lecture us about China when Israel is being so closely aligned economically with China. And this could well be a turning point for Israel's relationship with China. It's all very well to be, you know, under the umbrella of US protection, and Australia to be an ally of Israel's and the UK and other countries, arguably Australia and the US, more so than most, and yet be very economically close to the Chinese.
Absolutely. I was going to ask this question to Boaz. How is the public reaction, and is there any government reaction in Israel, given this close relationship? I remind, for those who don't know, that Israel has subcontracted its main port, the port of Haifa and the port of Eilat, to the Chinese. The Chinese in Israel are doing most of the infrastructure of Israel at the moment. They're constructing bridges, they're constructing roads, tunnels, and as we found out in our December dialogue, that was an information that was brought to the table by Professor Danby, who's one of the foremost economic professors in the world, not just in Israel, but he's from the Jerusalem University. And he brought that information that, in fact, the labor that China uses in Israel comes from prisoner laborers, the same way, he said, as what they do in Africa. So that surely should raise the alarm in Israel. Boaz, what do you think?
First of all, within the Israeli public, you don't find a lot of debates on that question. Unfortunately, I would say, but it's not a subject matter. We are more into the question, pro Bibi or against Bibi, and not the question of China altogether. Having said that, there is a very interesting piece of information, by the way, coming from the press as we speak. Yesterday, we had kind of a surprising visit of Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State of United States, and nobody really understands why did he come so urgently to Israel for 24 hours and flew back from Israel. There could be different explanations, but as we speak now in the press, there is a briefing from a high-level person from his own team, probably himself, incognito, that the reason was China. And the reason was a discussion or expectation of the United States from Israel to have a different approach, Israeli approach towards China. So it seems that although the Israeli public is not that interested in the subject, the Americans are very interested in that subject, and they monitor the Israeli economical relations with China very closely and have some concrete demands towards Israel, which are not published altogether. Going back to China and the coronavirus, I share with Michael this skepticism that this was a malicious intent of China to spread the virus. I don't think that's the case, but we cannot undermine the possibility of a leak from the biological institution, and definitely
possibility,
yeah. And there is a real concern on the fact that probably they didn't share the relevant information with the international community when it was needed. I mean, they delayed it for a few weeks, which are very important weeks for the preparation of the international community. Down the road, I think that the Chinese economy probably would be the only economy that will not be hurt from the process, because in the recent weeks and so they are importing a lot of medical systems to the international arena. And by the way, we are talking using the Zoom system. As far as I know, there is also a very close Chinese connection to the Zoom system. Just think about
all the servers are in China. That is all the servers of Zoom are in China, and it's Chinese technology.
Think about the enormous information that they might get just from monitoring the Zoom discussions all over the world in the recent weeks and months. So there are
like this one,
like this one. We are all doomed.
Certainly like this one. Because you're on it, Michael. It's the most dangerous person.
So I would be reluctant to recommend anything to Australia, but visiting quite a bit, a few times Australia with the great hospitality of Albert, I see the close dependency of the Australian economy in importing some goods, natural resources, and so on and so forth to China, but also closer to my field, the academia. I mean, the Chinese students in the Australian academia has a very important role, and I think
I'm going to ask you to conclude because we're going to be cut off very shortly.
Yeah, so I'm concluding. So yes, we are concerned in Israel, mainly not the public at large, but political scientists and others. But this is a global concern, as you noted, in Australia as well.
Thank you, Boaz. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Michael. That was a great first. Let's do it again soon.
Thank you. Good.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Great to see you, Boaz. Catch up soon.
Boaz, can I just tell you one thing? The Americans have threatened the strategic air force in Britain if the UK doesn't pull out of Huawei. So they're doing it everywhere. They're really putting the pressure.
But I read the article.
That was the last word. Sorry, guys. Thank you. We'll see you soon.
No, it's just fun. Namaste.